Now I am delighted to introduce our moderator for this Moral Conversations series. Tomorrow night, the National Organization for Women will be giving Irshad its Susan B. Anthony Award. Tonight, we have the benefit of knowing Irshad as the first recipient of Oprah Winfrey's Chutzpah Award for audacity, nerve, boldness, and conviction. If that wasn't enough, the New York Times has called Irshad Osama bin Laden's worst nightmare because she campaigns for universal human rights and intellectual freedom, and she does so as a faithful Muslim. Irshad is author of the international bestseller, The Trouble with Islam Today, now published in more than 30 countries. And because it is banned in Iran, Pakistan, and various parts of the Middle East, Irshad has posted free online translations, and collectively, they've been downloaded 1 million times. Irshad is also creator of the PBS documentary Faith Without Fear, which was nominated for an Emmy last year. Given her global reach, Irshad is a senior fellow with the European Foundation for Democracy, and as the title of tonight's series reminds us, she is director of the Moral Courage Project at New York University's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. Irshad will say more about moral courage and how it relates to the extraordinary conversation we are about to participate in with her and Christiane Amanpour. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Irshad Manji.
Well, you know, I've been called a sellout on many occasions, but tonight it's for all the right reasons. And I have a feeling it's for our special guest, not me. Welcome, everybody, to the Moral Courage Conversations, a series of dialogues in which we're exploring the future of free expression in a fragile world. Now, this issue, free expression, affects all of us because we're all human beings with unique voices, and yet we're also global citizens with a common destiny. And just to hammer home the array of people who care about free expression and moral courage, I want to give two special shout-outs. First, fresh off the bus from Connecticut, we've got students of Miss Porter's School for Girls. Word up, students. And stand up, ladies. Stand up. I'm having you stand up, girls, because I want my own students in the audience tonight to see who you are. And that way, they can warn you that there really will be a test at the end. The second shout-out is to delegates of a conference about social change, a conference organized by the Research Center for Leadership in Action, whose banners you see on stage tonight, and they're part of New York University's Wagner School of Public Service. They're also one of our sponsors, for which I thank them. And I thank as well the Ford Foundation and the European Foundation for Democracy. Democracy demands investigative journalism, speaking truth to power for the sake of democratizing information, uncovering it rather than merely covering it, putting it in more hands, spreading knowledge, which is power, and risking backlash for doing so. This is morally courageous journalism. Where do we have that today? How do we get more of it? And what, if anything, can citizens do to ensure moral courage in our multimedia age. Our special guest, Christiane Amanpour, will illuminate the challenges and opportunities before us. But I first want you to know why I approached her. It's not simply because she's CNN's chief international correspondent, nor merely because she has earned a slew of Peabodys and Emmys and a Courage Award itself from the International Women's Media Foundation. And it's certainly not just because it's high time to nail down where that accent comes from. I raise that, by the way, because Time magazine, if you can believe it, once called her accent elegant but unplaceable. Unplaceable, huh? Tonight, we will investigate. But back to the point. I approached Christiane because she dared to outrage Bill Clinton in front of her bosses. And because Yasser Arafat slammed the phone on her during a live broadcast. And because Iran's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad considers her rude. They all got questions they didn't want to hear. Now, we'll have a chance to watch some of these moral courage moments on video just a bit later. For now, I want to be thoroughly transparent with all of you about where I'm taking this conversation. I want to use these moral courage moments with Christiane to probe not so much geopolitics, as much as I want to probe the practice and potential of journalism, especially at a time when reporters and their employers feel enormous pressure, financial or otherwise, to avoid causing offense. Of course, you get to ask whatever you want during the audience Q&A, and the great thing is, you'll have the next 45 minutes to take tips from the star of tonight's show. Ladies and gentlemen, teachers and students alike, please welcome Christiane Amanpour. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I've got my little file of notes and articles that I clip and strip and use for reference. Thank you all for being here, and really thank you to all the 21 satellites who were there, including from my American home state of Rhode Island.
Where you went to journalism school, right?
Yeah, that's why I say my home. I'm obviously not from here, but it was the first place I landed when I came to the United States more than 30 years ago.
Well, Christiane, that brings us to your accent.
And, so I tell you what it is. It's Anglo-Iranian with a dash of Atlantic, so it's mid-Atlantic.
And that's really a great entree into asking you to tell us more about your upbringing.
My mother is English and a Catholic. My father is Iranian and a Shiite Muslim. I grew up in Iran and lived there all my childhood and all my life, and was there even until the Islamic Revolution, which turned 30 years old this month, just a week ago. I had a fantastic and idyllic childhood that I just recall with immense fondness, and it was fun. And more than that, living in the Shah's Iran, I was brought up without any sort of political consciousness. In fact, all of us were. It was not the fashion to question or to be political, as you can imagine. And I was too young anyway and too sort of sheltered to really have any political awareness. So for me, the Islamic Revolution of 30 years ago, which I witnessed and lived through, was, I would say, my first growing up, really, in terms of when my brain woke up and understood that there was more to the world than my wonderful, protected and sheltered childhood. But having said that, I do strongly believe that my parents' values prepared me for the life that I was thrust into, and I had an upbringing that was, I believe, moral, and certainly one that was filled with faith.
What kind of faith?
Well, my mother is religious, and I was taken to church regularly. I also knew intrinsically, simply by watching my own family, that people of different faiths, cultures, religions, ethnicities, my mother and my father come from completely different backgrounds, can get along. And that actually prepared me for this coverage that I've done throughout my career now of basically ethnic rivalries, ethnic cleansing, all sorts of divisions based on race, religion, and people's makeup.
Is it true that you went to journalism school purely by accident?
I sort of did, actually. You know how many people sort of know what they want to do with their lives when they're very young. Yeah. Many people dream of being a doctor or an astronaut or an engineer or a fireman or whatever it is. I didn't really have that many of those specific dreams until the revolution. I thought I wanted to be a doctor, but to be very frank, I failed the exams that would get me into medical school. And I ended up in the end in Iran during the revolution. And it was that made me realize that I actually wanted to be part of these cataclysmic international world events, but not as a participant or even a victim, but as somebody who could, in fact, try to explain those events to the rest of the world. And so I'd come to London, again, my mother's home country, as a way to get out of Iran. And my youngest sister had joined, out of the blue, who knows where it came from, a journalism college in London. And after a few weeks, she decided that it wasn't for her. So we were very skint. That means low on funds. Okay. And I went there and I asked for the money back because we needed it. And they said no. And so I said, okay, well, I don't like to waste money, and may I take her place? And I did. I took her place. And that's what set me on the road to journalism. And then I realized that in order to really make it in this world, especially of journalism and television, was to come to the United States, and where I had heard, because I didn't really know the United States, that if you have a goal, a mission, a dream, and if you're prepared to work hard, that you can make it. And that's literally why I came to the United States.
Take it from this Canadian, I buy that. Yeah. I really buy that.
And it's turned out nicely.
Yeah, it sure has. And to say the least. And before we show the audience just how nicely it's turned out through a compilation of video clips of some of your moral courage moments, let me quickly ask you, where do you think you got the drive to pursue inconvenient facts? What shaped that?
I'm not sure. I think it came along the way with the different work that I did. And when I say it turned out nicely, I don't really like to say that ahead of these clips you're going to see, because it's quite sort of dramatic and dire. But to be honest, I never actually, although I knew what I wanted to do, I never realized that it would take me precisely where it's taken me. And afterwards I'll explain.
Okay. Let's show the audience where it has in fact taken Christiane. Let's roll.
There's another launch. This is the Saudi-Kuwaiti border. Should Saddam Hussein escalate this crisis, the U.S. would consider a series of strikes. Christiane Amanpour, CNN, Tbilisi, Georgia. Many here predict the Bosnian Serbs will continue to test international resolve. More journalists have been killed or wounded covering the conflict in the former Yugoslavia. The UN says what's happening here is a systematic campaign of intimidation.
We must do something to stop the bloodshed in that country.
And do you not think that the constant flip-flops of your administration on the issue of Bosnia sets a very dangerous precedent?
There have been no constant flip-flops, madam.
Even in the best of times, Somalia was one of the world's poorest countries. The United States troops have been committed for a purely humanitarian mission. Mr. Arafat, can you tell me, please, are you under direct physical threat right now?
They have destroyed completely 7 of our buildings. Thank you. Bye-bye.
This is the entrance to the city of Basra.
I was inside the court. I saw Saddam Hussein come into the courtroom.
According to a new poll, 3/4 of Iraqis say they believe this election will produce a stable government. Here we are in Habila, a village that has not had any food distribution since June. These women and thousands of men kept lining up, eager to vote. More than 1,200 people were killed when the tsunami flipped this train. It sounds very aggressive, what you're saying. It sounds like we're headed for real confrontation.
No, we have no such intentions.
I'm Christiane Amanpour in Peshawar, Pakistan, the birthplace of bin Laden's terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda. Here, the legacy of AIDS is 12 million orphans and counting. They are God's warriors, and this is how they are shaping the 21st century. Where in the Quran does it justify the killing of innocents?
I'd like to get on to another question, because I've answered that question already.
Have you? It's taken me at least 9 years to get this visa. I'll teach you a word, okay? Friend. These thousands of monks have gathered here for what's called a long life ceremony for the Dalai Lama. He is, after all, the embodiment of Tibet's spiritual and political aspirations.
They should give us meaningful autonomy so that we can keep our own Buddhist culture.
This is Rwanda. This is where genocide went unchecked. The whistleblowers spoke out, but the world turned away. The Palestinian Authority has complained very bitterly about the disproportionate use of Israeli force.
The question of proportionality, I think, is being misused against Israel.
Christiane Amanpour, CNN, with elements of the Galilee division in Israel.
I couldn't help but notice that you didn't duck when that cannon went off. What's wrong with you?
Well, you see, at first it started with a duck, if you notice.
You flinched?
Yeah, I did.
But you didn't
in the first
duck.
Gulf War, I ducked. But 20 years later, I got used to it.
Is that the
Yeah.
real reason? I mean, you
That-
heard
that-
it behind you, and you just kept powering forth with your stand-up in front of the camera.
That's right. In a way, you know, I knew that if I ducked or stopped, I couldn't use it.
She's not just a good journalist, she's a great performer. That's
No,
very...
no, no.
No. I mean, the point that I'm making is that, you know, you do have to present your stories in a way that rivets people while being true to the facts. And obviously, that has been your stock in trade, which brings me to one of the clips in that compilation. Your encounter with Bill Clinton. Would you say that was your first, like, major moral courage moment? What happened there?
You know, I know this discussion is framed as such.
Sure.
I've never thought about any of it as courage or moral courage. I've just thought of it as doing what I have to do as a journalist. And so if you take the sort of the journey, I started, my first story was the first Gulf War. And that, for me, was an amazing beginning, because it was a time that CNN itself exploded onto really the world's consciousness. So I grew up at the same time CNN was growing up. We had an amazing time doing it. The first Gulf War was just a remarkable time that put CNN on the map, not to mention a really great story. And I learned so much of my craft right there in the field as it was happening. But that was a big and conventional war where massive armies were facing off against each other across a traditional battlefield. You had Saddam's army, but by his calculations and others was perhaps 1 million strong. You had the United States, which had gathered an alliance of some 500,000 troops from the US, from Europe, from Arab countries, all there to help repel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. And so the coverage and the understanding of that was quite basic. A country had invaded another sovereign country, and a group of allies were coming to push it back. That was a traditional military story to cover. Right. Straight after that, I found myself literally within months of the end of that war and the end of all the fallout, I found myself in the Balkans, where Yugoslavia was breaking up. And I first covered Croatia and then went on to Bosnia. And Bosnia, as many people probably remember, really ripped the United States and Europe apart for 4 years while they dithered, while genocide was being committed in cities like Sarajevo, Srebrenica, and all these other so-called UN safe havens. And what we witnessed as journalists who were there day in and day out, month in and month out, year in and year out, and who reported every day on what we were seeing, what we realized is that, you know, the world didn't actually want to call it what it was. The world didn't want to have to intervene, and therefore kept trying to tell public opinion that this was just a centuries-old ethnic conflict, and more importantly and crucially and falsely, that all sides were equally guilty. And so those of us who were living there and who were reporting it and who were actually part of the civilian population and therefore feeling and being affected by the bombardment of Sarajevo, we told the truth. I mean, we said that there is a group of victims, and here they are, the citizens and the residents of Sarajevo, who are under siege, who can't get out, who only have humanitarian aid coming in, and that's only when the Serbs who are besieging them allow them to do so, who are being sniped and shelled without discrimination, children, men, women, and I watched this on a daily basis, and my own colleagues were wounded. I was very, very lucky to escape, and very lucky so far to have escaped. But when you watch that, and you live with it, and you report, and suddenly you get people saying, well, the journalists, they're going a bit native. They're getting a bit of Stockholm syndrome. They're identifying too much, etc., etc., etc. Then I stood up and I started to question objectivity. What does it mean? Because our golden rule is objectivity. It's not to go out there and take sides per se and to set an agenda per se. It's really to pursue the truth and tell the truth and be able to obtain clarity in that way. So there are, though, extraordinary situations, and that is genocide, the highest crime in international law, in which we have to really look at what we do. And we cannot say that objectivity means neutrality. We cannot draw a false equivalence. We cannot be party to what our politicians were telling the world, which is that there was equivalence, that all sides were equally guilty. And so after 4 years of really trying to get this story out, and we did, you know, to suddenly have to ask a question of President Clinton, who at that point had not taken the decision to intervene, you know, I asked the only question I could ask, because just to give you some background, President Clinton was running for his second term, and he had chosen CNN as a global sort of forum whereby to give a major foreign policy speech, and he had agreed to take questions from the audience who was there, which was not just CNNers but others who were invited, and from some of the journalists overseas. Well, I was one of the journalists overseas. And I asked my question in direct response to what I had heard him saying. It wasn't pre-planned, it wasn't, you know, a calculated attempt. And I just asked what I had to ask. And he got very angry, but then afterwards he came back and he sort of said, that poor woman, you know, she's seen everything. But the point of the matter is that you just have to, you know, you have to ask the rigorous questions. That's what the audience expects. That's what we expect of ourselves. And you have to be willing to risk access and to risk people being angry with you, and to realize that you just have to do your job no matter where the chips may fall. And it wasn't easy for somebody like me who grew up in a very sheltered and respectful environment. As I say, I grew up in the Shah's Iran. You didn't question authority. And I know certainly that my parents and many of their friends were quite horrified that I had been so publicly rude to the President of the United States. I didn't think I was being rude, by the way. And
Madam, as the President said,
and then everybody
Madam.
called me Madam for years after that. It was great.
I'd wear that as a badge of honor.
Well, you know, I did what I had to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
so
I just want to, you know, I've very carefully written down some of these quotes. But, you know, many, many people who've gone before us and really, really been on the front lines of the fight for justice. For instance, Robert F. Kennedy. When he was in South Africa, in Cape Town, in the 60s,
he gave his big speech on moral courage.
He did. Yep. And this is one of what a little of what he said. Few men, he might have said, few men and women, are willing to brave the disapproval of their fellows, the censure of their colleagues, the wrath of their society. Moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. Yet it is the one essential vital quality for those who seek to change the world, which yields most painfully to change. And I think that is the bottom line. If you're not prepared to put yourself on the line for what you believe in, or just for your profession, I mean, you know, it's very difficult to actually do this job with any credibility or integrity. And I have been banned from many places, and I have been denied interviews by many officials because they think I'm too tough. I don't think I'm tough. You know, I wish I was a little tougher, but they think I'm too tough.
Why did Arafat hang up on you?
He hung up on me because it was in 2002. Palestinians had conducted a very devastating suicide bomb. It was called the Passover attack. It was in Netanya, in Israel. Many people had been killed. We covered that, and also that led to then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon deciding to re-invade the West Bank and basically surround Arafat in his compound. And that was about one of the first few nights that this had happened, that we got this live television connection, rather telephone connection. And I was on live television asking him about what had happened. And what really caused him to hang up was me asking him why he couldn't rein in the militants and stop this attack. And he started to scream at me for being a collaborator, for taking the Israeli point of view, and that I am General Arafat, and you had better be, you know, don't take the Israeli position and this and that. And he just basically hung up, which was quite mortifying. I mean, thank God for satellite distortion, because, you know, and including in this Clinton one, I mean, the red that went from my, you know, my neck up to my forehead. I mean, I was really embarrassed and hot under the collar. But, you know, you have to force yourself to not flinch. You know that, you know, the camera's on you. And so I had to force myself. But it's a very strange position to be in.
And this brings me to a much bigger question, Christiane, something that a lot of publishers and editors are facing these days. We all know that we live in a time of raging and rising religious fundamentalisms. Just last week in India, an editor and publisher of a venerable publication were arrested for running a column that defends secularism. And this is in the world's largest secular democracy. And they were arrested for maliciously, you know, offending religious feelings. How are the arbiters of media supposed to respond when they know that they are going to be accused of bigotry merely for letting their journalists do their jobs properly?
It's a very difficult situation that we all work in right now, whether you're an artist, whether you're a journalist, whether you're a writer of fiction or whatever, because the environment has been so distorted and unusually heightened and sensitized, mostly since 9/11 and sort of around that, a few years before and obviously several years afterwards. You know, there is a group of people who believe that they have a monopoly on righteousness. And it isn't just in the Islamic world. I did a whole series, perhaps you know, a couple of years ago called God's Warriors. Yeah. And one of the things that I found was that this fundamental belief that you are not just right, but that you have a singular direct line to God is a very real problem and a very dangerous threat. Not just physically, for some, in some quarters it is a physical threat, and in others it's a cultural, societal, intellectual threat, because the obvious reaction is to close down, to self-censor or to be censored. And that's something that we all really, really have to take on board very, very carefully. And of course, you are mentioning, you know, the extremes, the very uncomfortable and unacceptable extremes in many of these societies, whether it be in elements of India, whether it be in certain segments of the society in Europe, whether it be elsewhere in the Middle East or whatever. You know, unfortunately, some of this rabble-rousing is supported and egged on by the politicians who like to hide behind these things as a way of denying their own culpability or their own accountability for what's you know, let's say Egypt, for instance. Let's just take Egypt. You know, one of these, you remember the cartoon crisis that came from the newspaper in Denmark?
I'm trying to recall it.
Right. You know, this thing was not a big thing. It was there, it was in the paper, it lay dormant for, I think, several weeks.
As a matter of fact, the cartoons were printed in Egypt before the riots began.
Right.
Yeah.
And it was one leader who then went and told the other leaders, who then sort of created this groundswell of righteous indignation. And it wasn't necessarily a popular revolt against this, despite what it looked like and despite how it was reported. So we have to be really, really careful of all of that. And I have to tell you, and I'll bring out yet another one of my articles that I clipped for this event, propaganda is something that we have to be very, very careful about. And it doesn't just exist in the obvious and usual quarters and amongst the usual suspects. It exists, you know, even in today's world in our Western societies. Obviously in degrees, can't compare, you know, apples and oranges, but there is a deep strain of propaganda that still exists. You know, one of the quotes that's emblazoned on the U.S. Holocaust Museum is from General Eisenhower, who said the following after he toured one of the concentration camps in recently liberated Germany. And he basically said that it was his first public visit, and it was, quote, "to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." So, you know, what he was saying was, one of the problems with truth is that people don't want to hear it. That's a serious issue that many people have, and we journalists still have. In 2009, in the West, in the 20th century multimedia world, people still don't want to hear the truth. And many, many times when I go around and I do, you know, reporting that's controversial or not, or just plain reporting in disaster zones or war zones, the number of times people ask me, but is it really that bad? Or, you know, is that really true? People just don't necessarily want to believe what's possible, what's out there.
Well, and so I come back to the issue of what not just journalists, but their employers are supposed to do when, again, they know that by telling the factual truth, okay, not the interpreted truth, but the factual truth, all kinds of spokespeople for cultures, for ethnic communities, for religions will accuse them of discriminating. And you know that if people don't want to hear the truth, there's something else they don't want to hear, that I'm a racist, that I'm a neocolonialist, that I'm an imperialist. And these kinds of labels get slapped around and slung around willy-nilly these days because lobbyists know that they can shut down voices in the media by doing that.
They think they can.
I think they know they can.
Well, I'll give you an example. Maybe they can, again, if you're not prepared to stand up and say no.
Right.
No. No. It's a simple word. I got quite some flack after doing God's Warriors. I was portrayed by one particular interest group in a hijab, in an Islamic scarf, a completely unrelated image they took of me, and portrayed me in that fashion in a full-page ad in many of the newspapers here in the United States. And the implication, obviously, was that I was either a terrorist or a terrorist sympathizer or some kind of weird fundamentalist who couldn't be trusted. And they tried to create a campaign to get people to turn off CNN and to disassociate themselves with CNN. And they put the phone numbers of our top bosses on their ad and said, call them and complain. Well, some people did call and complain, and I asked our unit who takes all these, you know, calls. And what was amazing was it wasn't a big number, and only they told me that about a third of those people who did called in support of our programs. And what we did as a network was, we always accept if we've made factual errors or if we've been deliberately wrong or you know, if we violated the basic tenets of journalism. But we did not accept being intimidated for purely political reasons. And what we did was, we took out an ad and we advertised a re-airing of said series. And that was that. That was that. And
the campaign died?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. I must tell you that I get a lot of emails through my website from J school students, journalism school students, very concerned about the sorts of lessons they're being given in their classrooms, one of which, for example, is that there's a difference, you should know, between informing and offending. And these students often say to me, but Irshad, that cuts both ways. I mean, if religious dogmatists, you know, have views that offend me, and I'm not rioting okay, over the sincere offense that I feel, why should media coddle those who do take the easy and violent way out? Isn't that playing politics instead of doing journalism? What would you say to their professors who say inform but never offend?
Well, I would say that professors are wrong. On the other hand, I would say also that our job is not to go out to give deliberate offense.
I don't think anyone's talking about deliberate.
But the thing is, there is a certain strain of journalism which is called gotcha journalism. And it's not practiced so much here in the United States, actually. Here, people, in my view, are a little bit too polite. But if you go overseas, if you go to Britain, some of the best journalists there, best interviewers, are people who I would say go over the line into giving offense.
Like deliberately, intentionally?
It's not so much offense, it's real rigorous holding people's feet to the fire. It can come across as overly aggressive. To me, it's overly aggressive and counterproductive if you're not getting an answer. If you're constantly hammering this person and trying to interrupt and keep talking over them and you're not getting an answer, you need to recalibrate your style and try to figure out what you want. What you want to do is ask the questions, is for you as the journalist and the interviewer to be so prepared, to be really prepared. You don't just sit down in front of a world leader or worse, a world criminal, whether it's a war criminal or whatever, and not be prepared and allow them to use the seat opposite you as a platform for their own unopposed and unchallenged views. So I think that, you know, you do have to be prepared to give offense if giving offense means not treating them with kid gloves. So, but that takes enormous skill. It takes enormous respect for your opponent, the person who's in the other chair. You have to learn up on him. Her. You have to, you know, learn, you have to know what they've said, what they've done, really do it and hold their feet to the fire. And that to me seems essential. My criticism, if you like, here in the United States has been that there's way too much complicity between interviewer and interviewee. And, you know, so much is talked about the sort of the inside Washington. I mean, it's a kind of a cliche, but there is this sort of syndrome where too often those who cover power become intoxicated by power itself. And that's very, very dangerous. And for me, I think I've been extremely fortunate not to be around the people who I cover. In fact, what I mean by the leaders. I cover policymakers generally from afar, and I don't want to cozy up to them. They're not my friends. They're people who I report on. I don't really want to go out and have dinner and talk and chat and doing that. And I tell you, occasionally when I have done that, it has compromised me. And I know that it's a human, what's the right word? It's a human frailty. When you're with somebody and you're talking to them, you know, you develop a relationship. When you're having dinner with them on a personal level, you develop a relationship. And I think that we journalists have to be very careful to understand the boundaries of those relationships and to understand that while they're in power, they are not our friends. That we treat them objectively, we hold them accountable, and we're respectful but tough.
And again, that is where it's what does respect mean? That is always, you know, the tricky issue, because my simple point, and you already made your point that, you know, you would say these journalism professors are wrong to suggest that, you know, aggressive questioning immediately amounts to giving offense. But the fact is that we live in a time in which all kinds of people know that by hurling epithets and labels at somebody, you can actually shut down their questions right away. That's the impulse to self-censorship that you're talking about. Well, and it worries me that this is something that journalism school students are being told they ought to be concerned with.
You know, I didn't know that, and I hope that's not the case. I certainly hope it's not the case at the University of Rhode Island, where I studied, nor at the great journalism schools like Columbia or University of Missouri.
Where I get a lot of my emails from.
Okay, well, that's interesting. I mean, I really hope that that's not the case, and if it is, that it is you know, rethought. I think that there's several parts to what you've just asked. Self-censorship is something that happens because you feel the weight of the majority that's bearing down on you, and therefore you don't want to be out of step with the majority or with the loudest voice, and therefore you are careful what you say. Now, I believe, and I've been on the record of saying this many years ago, that the entire journalistic profession, with very few noble exceptions, self-censored and worse, marched in lockstep during the run-up to the Iraq War. That's, in my view, a fact, and many sort of mea culpas and examinations, self-examinations prove that since the Iraq War. I mean the latest Iraq War, 2003. People did not ask the tough questions. People were too willing to accept the administration's single-line storyline. They didn't go and double-check sources and go elsewhere and try to figure out what the real story was. Did Iraq have weapons of mass destruction? Now, it's true that many people, even experts, thought that they did. But the real question was, are these weapons, and is Saddam Hussein about to use them? That is what, a preemptive strike is designed to stop a country from striking you. There was no evidence to say that Saddam Hussein, A, had them or was about to use them. So it was the immediate threat concept that nobody asked about. Now, since the war, there's been a huge amount of, I call it spine stiffening, and an amazing number of excellent books, articles, and investigations into what happened and what went wrong and, what we can expect. And there's been some excellent journalism done. To get back to your question about giving offense, if you look at the original 60 Minutes format, if you look at the great legendary Mike Wallace, or Harry Reasoner, who's no longer with us, or Ed Bradley, who's no longer with us. Those people who staked out in what eventually started as a feature program, but had a very strong investigative arm to it, they staked out and they set the line very high. It was a very, very brilliant program that really, some people could say that the interviewers gave offense, but what they really did was do their homework, confront the interviewees with the facts, with their own words, with words that had been written about them, with deeds that they had done. And it was exceptional journalism, and it resulted in unbelievable, dynamics, changing the dynamic of the society, whether it was to get wrongly imprisoned people freed, whether it was to point the finger at things that really needed to be uncovered and investigated. Journalism, unless it's prepared to do the hard work, which is not just the physical but the intellectual hard work, is not really worth its salt, because if you look at the great journalists of the past, the muckrakers of the early 20th century United States, or the great investigative journalists like Woodward and Bernstein, and there are many, Edward R. Murrow, the real sort of secular god of broadcast news. These people all had to put themselves on the line at one point in their life. There came a time when they had to overcome the fear of being genteel and of going along to get along. And they all put their careers and their state of mind and their families and their reputations on the line. For Edward R. Murrow, it was during the McCarthy hearings, and before that, when he witnessed what happened in the Second World War and talked about the concentration camps and what was going on. I mean, when people don't want to hear you and you nonetheless speak out, what would our world be like if we didn't have those kinds of journalists? And this is what worries me about today's reality, because everybody thinks the blog is a substitute for real journalism, and I'm afraid it's not. Right.
And I want to talk about today's reality for just a moment, because you're right. We live in a very different culture now, where I would suggest the media bullhorns on one end of the political spectrum replicate the polarizing and pugilistic monologues of those on the other end of the political spectrum. They call it balance, whether it's on the left or the right. It's actually a competition, a contest of dogmas. But here's the problem, Christiane. telling people what they want to hear, feeding their prejudices, pays. Okay? And these media folks are raking in the money by spoon-feeding our particular prejudices.
It's a problem.
How then do we foster moral courage in that kind of an environment?
Look, it's an uphill struggle today, but there is so much good journalism out there and so many people who actually are brave and who really do, whether it's in print, in radio, or in television, or on the internet in some instances, who go out and speak against this. I mean, you know, from pugilistic, you can get to hate speech. Again, this is what happened during the Nazi rise to power in Germany. This constant, you know, manipulation and domination of the media, of posters, of the public space, where they just ratcheted up the hate. And that I saw in Bosnia. I saw it in Rwanda. And do you know what? I see it on the extreme radio here in the United States. Obviously, the levels are different, but the intent is the same. It's to dehumanize the other. It's to delegitimize those who have a different opinion. This morning, I'm listening to my radio, and I'm listening to WNYC, and there was a report about the budget in California, and they used a clip from one of these very extreme, angry, right-wing talk radios in California, and they had to bleep words. The vulgarity, the virulence, the hate that was spewing out of this radio host on the politicians who were trying to pass some budget. Okay, maybe they're not, you know, purer than the driven snow, but the words that were being used were just unacceptable to the point that a normal radio station had to bleep them out, and then said that, you know, one of the campaigns by these people who opposed the budget was, you know, showed some of the politicians with, you know, posters with their heads impaled on, you know, on sticks. I mean, this is 2009 in the United States. This is medieval, what's being done. And I saw what happened in Rwanda when people didn't stand up to that kind of hate speech and that kind of, and the media was the one that propagated there in Rwanda. So that's what happened in Rwanda was, you know, the opposite of listening to those who had moral courage. Right. General Dallaire, Alison DeForge of Human Rights Watch, who was so tragically killed in this air crash in Buffalo, she warned way back when of a genocide brewing, and then she wrote the definitive article. And you know, it took moral courage for her to insist back in May of 1994, which was just a month after the genocide, and way ahead of the curve of the UN or national governments, including the US government, insisted that what was happening there be called genocide. Oh, don't call it genocide. Everybody goes into, you know, freak out mode, because actually, when you call it what it is, you are
responsible for doing something about it.
You are legally, it is legally incumbent upon you under international law and the Geneva Conventions to take action and to punish it, and, you know, to stop and to punish it. And look, I lived for years in Bosnia. They would not use the word genocide. They would not use it.
Yeah. I just quickly want to get back to your point about, you know, the way some of these hateful right-wing radio talk show hosts are
hateful
fighting
on any wing, by the way.
Well,
any wing.
And that was actually my next point, is that let's again be very clear that, you know, when Keith Olbermann, for example, does his worst person in the world segment at the end of every show, okay, that is a dehumanization and demonization of individuals as well. And that is what I'm so concerned about, is that whether on the left or on the right, what we're getting today is a competition, a contest, a showdown of dogmas, rather than any kind of an incentive for ordinary people to think critically about the information and misinformation that they're being fed. And so I bring it back to the bottom line question. There may or may not be an answer to it tonight, which is, you know, what responsibility do we as citizens have to ensure that we are playing our role in fostering moral courage? We're consumers. Some of us are advertisers. Fewer of us are owners. But we're all part of a grander constellation of players. And we, as viewers and listeners and readers, have to count in some way. What do we do?
Well, I agree. I mean, I think that we as citizens have to understand the responsibility of what it means to be a citizen. I think what happened in the United States during the election campaign is actually very encouraging, because it was a country rising up more or less. I mean, okay, it was half and half, but a huge number of people in this country rose up and said, enough of dogma, enough of false partisanship, enough of false ideology, enough of demonizing one or the other. Let's just try to move forward and do things differently. So I think that a lot of the young people in this country have been sensitized, and I think that's one of the fantastic things that led to no matter which way the election went, the campaign, I thought, was very, very interesting in how it mobilized people. Because, you know, one of the terrible raps that the United States has is this complete sort of apathy when it comes to the political season. You have a turnout here in the United States for presidential elections, which is amongst the lowest in the democratic world, but not this time. And things changed because I think precisely people felt like, we are citizens of this world. We care about our country. We care about our community. We care about how we're going to go forward. And enough of this hate and bigotry and dogma. And I do think that that stuff still exists, you know, on the fringes, and it will always exist on the fringes. There will always be a place. There will always be a place where that kind of dogmatic, pugilistic, vulgar, you know, turn-off kind of speech exists. The question is, does it infect the whole? Does it infect the mainstream? And that's where we have to be careful.
Well, if you consider MSNBC or Fox mainstream, I would answer, we've got a big problem. Okay? All right. On that note, let us turn it over to the audience. And I want to encourage the students in this audience especially to come up to the microphones and ask your morally courageous questions. And while we're, can we bring the house lights up? Great. Look, Christiane, they're all here for you. Look at that. How wonderful. While I am waiting for a few more people to come up to the mics, let me quickly ask a question from one of our satellite participants. All right, here's one from Wichita, all the way from Wichita. How do you balance your objectives and your safety on the job when you're in dangerous situations?
With difficulty, and with increasing difficulty, because most unfortunately, one of the terrible things of the last 10 years, at least, is that, well, really, actually, since I've started working in the field, so the last 18 years or so, Bosnia was sort of the turnaround case where journalists started to be deliberately targeted. In the wars beforehand, by and large, journalists were killed, but they were killed in the crossfire. Now, you know, as the message is becoming more and more out there, more and more visible, as live television is so much more powerful, the impulse to shut down and shut up the messenger is growing rather too strong, to the point that today the leading cause of death amongst journalists, the leading cause of death is deliberate. It's murder. It's assassination.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which is, as you know, completely skewed, because in the general population it's heart disease and other such stuff. Right. In our community, it's deliberate.
It's assassination.
Yeah. And there's too many people who've fallen victim to that. So how do you balance it? You try to be as careful and responsible as you can, but it really is, the truth is that it's getting more difficult, much, much more difficult.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to the microphones. I'll start with you, sir. One quick sort of ground rule, if I may, which is no multi-part questions, please. Otherwise, Christiane gets to, you know, address the one that she likes most. And second, please keep your question to 30 seconds or less.
And to be a question.
And for it to be you've heard it here first. Go ahead, sir.
Hello, my name is Bruce Knotts. I'm the Executive Director of the Unitarian Universalist United Nations Office. And when I was young, there were lynchings going on in the American South of people of color. And it was a story that wasn't in the mainstream media. It took a long time for that story to creep into the mainstream media. Nowadays, I get on my screen a lot of stories of really atrocious things happening to gays, lesbians, bisexual, and transgender people around the world. There was a statement read at the General Assembly at the United Nations on December 18th.
You're getting to your question, I'm sure.
Yes. Where 66 countries called for the abolition of laws which criminalize sexual orientation and gender identity. Why is this story not in our mainstream media?
It's a good question. I mean, to the point that I actually didn't even know some of those facts. But you're right. I mean, there are so many issues that need to be covered that aren't. I mean, I think, to be very frank, and I've asked some of, some members of, the gay community and others why they think that that is the case, that so little is reported. And in general, they do face that discrimination, and it's very difficult to get their stories into the mainstream press. I think I may be talking out of turn, but I do believe CNN is planning to do a major work on this precise issue. I can't give you details because it's not public, but I do believe that we are planning to do a major look at these problems in the community that you're mentioning.
Thank you, sir. I'll turn it over to the next mic before I go to the next satellite feed.
Ms. Amanpour, my name is Mitchell Agus. You mentioned in your talk that the job of a journalist is not to take sides, and yet there exists in the world strong feelings that your coverage and that of CNN has strongly tilted in the favor to the Palestinian and the Arab cause. Can you tell me why that strong feeling exists? I hear it more and more, and whether you feel you've contributed to that feeling?
I would answer that by saying that I know those accusations fly. I would obviously reject them. If you look at our reporting, it is about as fair as I think it can be. I do think that we do try to tell all sides of the story, and people don't like it, sir. People don't like it. And unfortunately, one of the big issues that I have, and I just don't accept and I reject, is that, in particular reference to what you're obviously asking me, is that there are some people and some groups who believe that if you report objectively, you're being anti-Israel. They equate reporting objectively with being anti the state, and I simply reject that. So that's my answer to your question. I think that some people would like to put that rap on us. I alluded to it somewhat in my description of some of the pressure groups on after my God's Warriors series, and I say, ladies and gentlemen, that's your problem. That's not our problem. We do not go out to do that. And I think it's time to call a spade a spade.
No, sir, no multi-part questions.
I answered it so fully and so frankly.
Yeah. Which actually brings me to an interesting question from Pittsburgh. Christiane, do you think that liberal, pluralistic religious expressions will shape our long-term future, or will traditional religious expressions shape that future? And can I just add to whoever asked that question that within the faith of Islam, pluralistic expressions have in fact been traditional ones. The much more rigid, much more dogmatic expressions have been really much more contemporary.
Well, I hope with education, and this is again very, very important, winning the hearts and minds of the young generation now. How to make sure that the young people, the children who are in school, the kids who are about to go to university, the people who are going to shape the reality in various parts of the world, don't fall victim to those rigid dogmas. And there are ways to prevent it. There are ways to prevent it.
When the United States, how do we do that?
Well, when the United States went in and overthrew the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, this was a huge opportunity, a huge step to reshape that massive part of the Islamic world. And to be frank, while it may have looked like in the media that the world was against the U.S. going into Afghanistan, in fact, that's not the case. There were very few pockets of very loud people, but I personally did my best to try to put that always in context that, look, the cameras are looking at these, but the demonstrations are very localized and they're not all over the Muslim world. So what happened, unfortunately, in Afghanistan is that this very promising beginning, new beginning, in November 2001, when Kabul fell and the Taliban were tossed out and Al-Qaeda sent packing as well, girls' schools started to open, women's issues, boys' schools, a return to a modicum of the rule of law, you know, all sorts of really positive steps. And then what happened? The U.S. took its eye off the ball and went to Iraq. And today, now, the Obama administration has to go back and see whether it can fix it. And it's got very, very bad, not just in Afghanistan, but in Pakistan, which is a big threat. There's a great American by the name of Greg Mortensen. I'm sure many of you have read 3 Cups of Tea. A former American military and climber who found himself in one of these amazing valleys in Pakistan years ago, and after the kindness that the strangers showed him there, decided that education would be his gift to those people who were illiterate but really wanted to learn. And with very little money, he was able to build dozens of schools, and it made a significant difference. Just this week, the Pakistani government has made a deal with the Taliban in precisely that region to allow them a safe haven, which is pretty much what it amounts to. Schools are being closed. Girls are being attacked. Acid is being thrown in women's faces. And here we go again. So there are ways to deal with this. There are ways to deal with this. But you see, nation building and education, these are not sexy topics. Who wants to hear about them? What media wants to put it on? I really have to work hard. I do it. I put it on. I really have to work hard to get this stuff on. And it's going to be...
Even you have to fight to get this stuff on the air.
But it is going to be the topic of my next documentary, so stay tuned for the summer.
Literally, stay tuned. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, how are you? I just want to know, who are the journalists today that you admire and respect, and also who were your mentors?
You know, mentors is a very American concept, and I didn't have it. I came to this country sort of already as an adult. I was a late student. I was about 20, 21 years old when I became a freshman at university here. And I had a very strong view of what I wanted to do. Having said that, there are people who I really admired. I tell you, journalists, for instance, like Peter Jennings, not because he was an anchor, but because he was this foreign correspondent who went all over the world and gave a different perspective. And then when he became an anchor, he really, you know, used his platform to, as much as he could, educate and inform really, not educate, inform people about different perspectives and about the world. So he was somebody. This wonderful legendary woman called Oriana Fallaci, who I don't know whether, yes, you know, she recently died, and she was an extraordinary person. And talk about offense, boys. She cornered the market on giving offense. In those interviews. I mean, literally, she sat down in front of Ayatollah Khomeini and took off her veil, because
and threw it at him, I think.
Well, she just sort of took it off. Okay. The legend was a little too...
That's the columnist in me coming out. Yeah. She's the reporter.
But, you know, her interviews to this day are really things that all journalists should study. She learned so well her subject. She was really informed. She really held people's feet to the fire. And today there are some exceptional journalists working. I really love the crew from the McClatchy newspapers, who I've known from Bosnia and who really made a big difference and staked out their own independent territory during the lead up to the Iraq war. There's fantastic documentarians at work today, and journalists who, you know, are really ready to, as I say, put themselves on the line. That's what it takes. We have to put ourselves on the line, and unless we're willing to walk the walk, then we shouldn't be in this profession.
Over to a student from Miss Porter's in Connecticut. Welcome.
Good evening. My name's Lauren Berger. I am a student from Miss Porter's, and I have a Machiavellian question for you that addresses the apathy, I think, as you said, of specifically the American people to not address horrific events that occur. Is there, assuming that your ultimate goal is to mobilize government to stop genocide, to stop mass murders, discrimination, is there an extent to which you will go and report on what's happening to mobilize the masses, or is there a line at which you say, I will not cross?
That's an interesting question because it goes to the activist nature of journalism. If you believe that journalists should be activists, then there's no length to which a journalist shouldn't go to make their case. Personally, I find that dangerous because if you start going down the road of being an activist, how do you know, which is the right activism to be pursuing? We know because we're educated, we've been to school, we understand that genocide is something that we have to stand up against. And there are other grave violations of humanitarian law and human rights that we know as a people, as a community, that we have to stand up and take a stand against. I think that just by doing our job, we mobilize. I strongly believe that just by doing our job in Bosnia, year after year, the kind of reporting you simply don't see anymore on television. The news networks do not put their resources into keeping people in locations and having them report day after day with pictures and interviews and all of that, and putting it high up in their news programs. I lived luckily in the last generation where that was possible, and so our stories were on the air all the time, and in the end it caused mobilization. I think it helped. I'm not saying we were the only ones, but the whole group of journalists who were there from the United States, radio, television, print, from Europe and elsewhere, made it finally impossible for Western, decent democracies and leaders of democratic countries. They simply could not tolerate the wanton slaughter of men, women and children anymore, shown on their televisions in their living rooms. So that was a good thing that we did, but just by doing our job, which meant just by going out and reporting the story. And the reason why it really was good is because when it came to Kosovo, which you're probably too young to remember, but in 1999 the same was about to happen in Kosovo after 4 or 5 years of it happening in Bosnia. Peace came to Bosnia, and then the Serbs turned their attention. Serbia turned its attention to Kosovo. And at that time Clinton was still president, and the same group of people were still in power, and they basically said, we cannot allow what happened in Bosnia to happen in Kosovo. So they preemptively intervened on a humanitarian basis and stopped a genocide. This is good. This is when journalists do the right thing. But there are many, many other ways that journalists can do the right thing. For instance, witnessing and bearing witness to famines and crises. Right. It was a BBC reporter in 1984 that exposed the great Ethiopian famine of that time. People didn't want to believe it. People didn't want to believe the words that were coming out, the words that were coming from Ethiopia. This man put the pictures on the air, and the world changed. And suddenly, there was Live Aid, there was all of that stuff, Bob Geldof and all of that, It mobilized people.
And Christiane, I don't know if you would agree with this example, but I just want to quickly tell Lauren that I remember in December 2007, just about a year ago, or 2 years ago, I guess, that a woman in Saudi Arabia was gang raped. And she was going to be imprisoned by King Abdullah because by virtue of being gang raped, she's the one who was accused of dishonoring her community. What happened was that a number of local Saudi activists, human rights activists, rose up, but how were they ever going to get notice for their campaign? And I remember CNN here in this country taking up that campaign day in and day out on Wolf Blitzer's Situation Room, actually covering this story and having an opinion about it. And it shamed King Abdullah so much that he in fact retracted his intention to imprison this woman. Now, why the victim of a gang rape should have to be pardoned as opposed to the criminal is a different issue altogether, and a very important discussion to have among diplomats. But the point is that, and it goes back to something Christiane said, just by doing their job, they made a difference. And really, that's all we're talking about, is to not stand back and say, well, that's how they do it over there. No, exactly. That we have no right to get involved in any way, even by covering a story, because then we are, intervening and we're being imperialists. That is such crap. Moving right along.
You said it, not I.
Moving right along. I'm the columnist, she's the reporter.
Keeping right up with that. Catherine Stetz, pre-Wagner alum. Along the lines of coming up with our 6th anniversary on the war, and so much going into the coverage of that, I wonder, have we lost sight of the rest of the world? I just came from a wonderful film, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, and I realized how little, even though I'm in the peace and justice movement, how little I understood of what went on when Christian and Muslim women who never spoke gathered together to drive a bloody dictator.
This is about Liberia?
This is out of Liberia,
Yeah.
and I thought I was a person who followed this. I worked towards peace and justice, and I wondered if I had been reading the London Times, would I have really known this? Because I was blown away.
So your question is?
My question is, do we here in the United States follow only a certain amount of the news, and have we gotten very tunnel vision?
Yes.
And is Europe a wider breadth?
Much.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I regret deeply. I just believe that the more foreign news you can get on American television, the better. And I think that, you know, the facts are borne out. When there is compelling storytelling told on American television from around the world, viewers do come. And I think that it's a sort of a unfortunate problem that the bosses, for various reasons, a lot of it is financial, a lot of it is just maybe genuine ignorance. They believe that Americans don't care about the world. I don't happen to believe that. I think Americans do care about the world. Whenever there is a crisis or some terrible disaster, the number of Americans that get involved and give and charity and care and all the rest of it is phenomenal. I mean, this is a society that cares, that's compassionate, and that I think does care, but you know, you have to make these stories relevant and compelling. And the problem is that with the financial restrictions way before even the economic crisis, but with all our networks now being owned by corporations instead of the great publishers of yesteryear, unfortunately the profit motive has been the dominant motive. And it wasn't enough just to make money. Now you had to make a huge profit margin. And that's what started killing us, basically, and crippling the ability to do these stories. I think I have to say that CNN still stands out as being the most committed of all the American networks to covering international news. We have a huge number of bureaus all over the world. We have a sister network that's called CNN International. We have, you know, a real commitment to doing that. And even on CNN USA, we currently have a program that does foreign policy. We have documentaries that I do about, you know, different parts of the world. It is difficult, even with the best will in the world, to tell every story in every corner of the world. But in general, there's just not enough of it on the air here. And in general, you're right. If you go to Europe, or if you go to the Middle East, or if you go to the Far East, they know much more about the world and much more about America than vice versa.
I did promise that during the Q&A you guys could ask whatever you wanted, even though I'll ask about journalism. Here's a question about geopolitics from Augusta, Georgia. Christiane, what is your prediction for the upcoming Iranian presidential campaign?
Very interesting. I've covered Iran for a long time. Not only am I an Iranian, but I went back 13 years after leaving during the revolution, during the Gulf War, and I've been covering it pretty much every year since. I've covered all the elections since 1991. And I also covered the election of Ahmadinejad and before him of Khatami, the two very different. One's the fundamentalist, the other is the reformer. Now they're both going to be facing off against each other in June, and this is going to provide an amazing opportunity potentially. I do not want to say who I think is going to win, because I'll tell you why. Two reasons. Khatami in 1997, the reformer took the entire world by surprise. He took Iran by surprise, or the powers that be there. He took the West by surprise. Nobody thought that this reformer was going to win. He came from nowhere and captured the imagination of this very young country, people who are highly educated, people who want to be part of the world, people who are sick of being under, you know, this authoritarian regime, people who want you know, to be part of the world rather than isolated and under sanctions and, you know, treated like the pariahs of the world. So they voted for Khatami, but because he was unable to deliver, I'm not sure what people are going to think about him as he comes back. I'm not sure. And furthermore, the flip side to that issue is that Ahmadinejad, who was facing severe dissatisfaction amongst the fundamentalists and the conservatives, which was splitting the vote. I know it sounds weird, maybe you don't think there's a democratic process, but there is a more democratic process in Iran than in any other Arab country or Muslim country.
Well, he's now Muslim country near the Middle East, Indonesia, for example, has a democratic process.
So all the conservatives are now lining up behind Ahmadinejad. So let's see. But the real question that that I would like to answer is the United States going to follow through on what President Obama has said, and that is to start engagement with Iran? 30 years of isolation haven't worked. 30 years of isolation have just left the two countries in a total state of limbo with both, with the issues coming out of Iran that nobody can figure out how to deal with. Isolation hasn't worked, sanctions haven't worked, nothing has worked. So, what is the next step going to be? And to my mind, I don't think the U.S. should be mistaken into waiting for the election before it tries to engage, because the center of power is not just in the presidency, it's not just in the religious leadership, it's not just in the parliament, it's a consensus group. So once they take a decision, which they have in Iran, to want to engage with the United States and completely refashion the relationship, it's a genuine decision. And I really think that this is something that should be pursued, because without Iran's constructive engagement, things like Iraq, Afghanistan, the Middle East peace process, none of that is going to be resolved, much less the nuclear issue. And we talked about moral courage, and again, it's not a framework that I particularly like to take for myself. I just say doing my job. One of the more difficult parts of doing my job is reporting from places like Iran or North Korea in a way that is objective, but goes against the grain of the majority of reporting in this country. So you have a certain storyline about Iran. There's a certain storyline. Iran, very bad. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So I go there, obviously with my knowledge of the place, with my ability to speak the language, with my ability to talk to various officials and this and that, and go beneath, go into the layers of complexity, talk to the women, talk to the young people, find out that there is another face. And that's also difficult. I went to North Korea with the New York Philharmonic, and I came back with a story that, obviously acknowledged the very bad things that go on in North Korea, but also spoke about the real hope of a bit of a thaw that was going on at that time. And it was very risky to do that, because people didn't want to hear it, and people think that you're capitulating and that you're being, snowed and whitewashed and all the rest of it. They can't quite understand that actually, the lens is not that focused. You really do have so many different layers and so many different realities to all these places.
It's a much wider angle.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We've got time for just one more question on each side. Go ahead, sir.
Hi. I was wondering, my name is Jorge Suarez, I'm from Mexico. I was wondering if you're concerned about the future of traditional media. I mean, it's unlikely that in 20 years there'll be room for a well-traveled, well-read correspondent like you, because newspapers are going bankrupt. People want to read their blogs from people who are far removed from the reality or from where things are really happening. I can, read, if I'm extreme right, I can read all day about that. Even in your network, the biggest commercial success is Blue Dobbs, who, in my personal opinion, is an absolute ignorant, and who promotes a very strong anti-immigration view that is totally against the nature of this country. So, are you concerned? I mean, it's...
Yeah, especially when you put it that way. I'm very, very concerned. In 20 years, I hope to be retired. But to the serious issue that you raise, newspapers are under threat. There's no doubt about it. They're under threat. Even the august newspapers such as the New York Times are worrying about what their future is. Already some newspapers have had to close down. Many have had to close down. Already even the extraordinary situation whereby some are increasing their readership, but in today's climate, the advertisers are not going there. So it doesn't matter if they've got booming readership, to hell with that. The advertisers don't want it, so, goodbye newspaper. It worries me for the blogs who sit back and get all their information from the newspapers. I'd like to know what they're going to be doing, how they're going to be reporting, because they are mostly second-hand or third-hand. They take it from people like us, who are who get up and go to these places and provide the first-hand reporting. So that's a problem. I think television has maybe a bleak future, but not as bleak, because people are still very committed to the visual image, whether it be on the big screen, whether it be on the computer screen, whether it be on the iPod or whatever platform you want. So I think television has slightly less to worry about at the moment in that regard. But in general, yes, it's a very big problem if the people of this nation don't have some kind of first-hand sources of reporting that they can get accurate information from. It's a big problem. I mean, I hate to say it, but maybe there are too many newspapers around, but that doesn't mean to say there should be no newspapers.
I am curious, though, Christiane, given that you travel the world and Lou Dobbs focuses so much on immigration, has he ever had you on his show? I'll ask one other question which you may or may not choose to respond to. Have you ever been invited and declined to be on his show? Okay. I think we'll reach our own conclusions thereafter. Young man.
My name is Ben Proffer, and I'm a fact checker. And I was wondering
for who?
For Elle magazine.
It's good. It's a good magazine. We like Elle. It's a good magazine.
Thank you.
It's got a foreign name.
Monosyllabic, so it works for me.
Go ahead.
Very easy to pronounce. My question is about ADD and
it's about who?
ADD and the 24-hour news cycle.
Yes.
And I worried that it's getting reporting is getting washed down a little bit by the 24-hour news cycle, and that I know from fact checking that it takes a while to really understand the very thin specifics of a story, and I worry that it's making the short-term memory of at least my generation very, very short.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what you thought about that.
I think it's a problem. I think ADD in all its forms is a problem. But I think you're right. There have been fantastic, positive outcomes from the 24/7. Look, Ted Turner created 24/7. He created this media revolution which we're all now living, and that everything has come after it has been a copy. When Ted started it, he did it, obviously it was a great business, but he didn't go into it just for business. I mean, he was bankrupt for many of the years that CNN first started. I mean, didn't know how to make the payroll, et cetera, et cetera. People were writing him off all the time. Other broadcast stations were trying to put him out of business by shutting him down, closing him off cable, satellite, all the rest of it. But he went into it in order to provide more information, in order that there wasn't a monopoly on information, in order to give more depth of information and a broader perspective. And then he took CNN International, again the first international 24/7 operation, and in the world, not in America, in the world, television operation. And so that's the positive. It democratized information. It gave those in the world who had no other access other than their own state-run media in many of the authoritarian parts of the world, in the United States where there was only 3 networks and they had the monopoly, and everybody said, who's going to want to listen to news 24 hours a day? But he found that people did want to. So there was a lot, and there was no ADD to speak of at that particular time. But like all good experiments, things go awry, and now 24/7 has so changed the way the world works. Not just people who consume it, but those, for instance, the politicians, the leaders in government, leaders in business, leaders in all sorts of different endeavors. There's barely enough time to react to anything before the news cycle is constantly changing, and it is a dangerous. It is a dangerous problem, because it means there's not a lot of huge thought that goes into some of these major things that have to be dealt with. And I strongly believe, I hate to say this, but I think the Iraq War was like that, you know? There wasn't a huge amount of thought, certainly, that went into the post-war reality, as we know. Nobody thought about it in government. They just thought it was going to happen.
Flowers and candies.
You know?
Before we wrap up formally, Christiane, I want to see if we can come up with a tip or two for those journalists who do aspire to moral courage. And I'll tell you what lesson I take from you. And then I'd like to turn it over to you to give us the lesson you'd like to leave us with. My lesson from you actually goes back to your moral courage moment. I know that you don't want to put it that way, but I will, with Bill Clinton. And a few years later, as I understand the story, he invited you, or his people invited you to the White House? No.
One of his staffers who had no idea what had happened and
right.
who had the courage to walk me through the White House door when everybody's saying, are you crazy?
Right.
You brought her here? Don't you know the boss hates her?
Right. But as I also understand it, the boss eventually told you that he respects the challenge that you advanced because, as again he put it, or as I read that he put it, you questioned me on the issues, not on scandals. In other words, there's a difference between gotcha, as you earlier told us, and I got to understand this.
Yeah.
And I got to hold you accountable.
He did say that, and he was actually, I thought it was very gracious, actually, and you know, it was pretty scary, actually, going to the White House. I thought that, everything was forgiven if I was going to be allowed to go to the White House, but I didn't know that nobody knew about it, and nobody knew I was coming, you know. So it was pretty scary, and I had to go through this receiving line.
Right.
And my poor escort, this poor guy who I dearly love, and in fact the son of the former governor of New York, his name is Paul Carey, and he's no longer with us. He succumbed to cancer a few years ago, but it was a wonderful, wonderful guy who invited me to one of these state dinners. And I had to go through the receiving line. Of course, President Clinton loved this guy and gave him a huge bear hug and all the rest. And I'm like standing here, and you know, and he put out his hand and he said, you know, we've already had our encounter, and you know, and
Madam,
and then he said, precisely what you said. And I just thought, you know, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that was big. That was big of you, and it's true. I didn't care about Monica Lewinsky.
Right.
I cared about genocide in Bosnia.
Right.
You know,
right.
And he was big about it, and I think that was important.
Well, and that's the key distinction that I would suggest, you know, young journalists can reflect on in order to do their jobs with credibility and integrity. The difference between, you know, the gotcha rebellion for rebellion's sake, and what I would and what Robert F. Kennedy would call moral courage. Now, what's your lesson for young journalists who wish to do their jobs with integrity in a world that too often takes offense too quickly?
You know, I suppose in a nutshell I would say don't be afraid of not being liked. Don't seek to be liked, because if you do, everything is compromised, everything's in play. There's no line, there's no line that you can hold and that you can walk. Don't seek to be liked by anybody, which doesn't mean to say be horrible, mean, and vindictive and rude, but it just means do your job to the best of your ability, understand what journalism is, understand that this is a huge responsibility that those of us who choose this profession take, because look, we have this microphone, we have this, as the young man from Elle accurately said, we have this enormous 24/7 platform that reaches millions, hundreds of millions of people if you take CNN around the world. And we cannot afford to play fast and loose with that platform. And we cannot afford to use it as a vanity project platform. And we cannot afford to use its power lightly. We have to understand what we have taken on and what power has been vested in us, not because of us and who we are, but because of what microphone we have in front of us. And therefore we have to rise to that occasion. We have to be willing to do the hard work, physically, intellectually, morally, and know that as long as you pursue the truth, not somebody's truth, but it is possible to pursue as close as possible the objective facts. I strongly suggest to journalists of today to stay rooted in fact-based reality and to not give in to this terrible disease, which is to think that you are somebody and to think that just because you're on television you have the right to dictate to people how they should think, which is what's happening right now in many elements of many different spectrums of the media. And I think that that's really the most important lesson, and to never be afraid, to never be afraid.
Ladies and gentlemen, the likable enough Christiane Amanpour.
As Barack said to Hillary. Very good. Thank you.